I almost called this Abraham's treasure. And he gives us a wonderful example of what true discipleship and stewardship really is. Do you remember his treasure? What is your greatest treasure? Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. And so we see the beginnings of one of the most riveting stories ever written. A man and his wife, well past their prime. He's 100, she is 90, and an angel comes and tells them they are going to have a kid. And do you remember what happened? I heard she laughed. They both laughed. Let's be fair. Abraham giggled too, just not as openly. In fact, laughter was a part of Isaac. When he got here, they even named him Laughter. That is what Isaac means. And there's no doubt that he brought great joy into their lives. In fact, God had told Abraham that all the nations would be blessed through this child. Something that any father would have liked to hear. My son is going to be amazing when he grows up. And you can imagine the pride in Abraham as he thought, my boy is going to be great. Now, Abraham, through the years, had become quite wealthy. And now in his old age, he was about to have a legitimate heir. Now, with what you know about Abraham, would you say that he had been blessed? Yes, blessed indeed. Of all the blessings that Abraham and Sarah had, which one do you think they treasured most? If you were them, which one would you treasure most? You see, this is part of what makes this story so riveting and confusing. Why would God give such a valuable gift as a son in their old age, only to demand it be returned? I mean, was God being cruel? Or was Abraham needing a change of perspective that could only be taught with a 2x4? Let me explain. There was a farmer who was having a trouble with trying to get his mule to work. The mule just sat there and acted like a mule, wasn't doing anything. So he tried everything he could, but the beast just simply would not budge. So he calls the vet. I'll get an expert to come get him. And the vet comes over there and he looks around and reaches over and picks a 2x4 up out of the barn and just slaps that mule right between the eyes. And that mule stumbles and falls back and gets back up. And the farmer grabs the reins and the mule just walks right with him. And the farmer's just amazed. And he says, I don't understand. And the vet, as he handed the reins to the farmer, he said, there's nothing wrong with your mule. The only thing is you got to get his attention. You think God's directive about Isaac got Abraham's attention? Friend, what is your treasure? What is your treasure that threatens to be your God? I'm not saying that Abraham was there or that you were there, only that we need to stop and assess our perspective at times. Whether or not we see what we have as a gift from God, and we recognize that those gifts are His, or if we are letting what we have been blessed with take His place in our lives. Abraham, as you know the story well, you can read it back over and remind yourself. But he willingly and quickly and completely, without hesitation, does what God asked him to do. And there in Genesis 22, we read, early in the morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey, took him with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God told him about. There is no mention of Abraham here intending to do anything other than what God asked him to do. And then yet, you who are parents, you understand how really hard this had to be. In fact, it was so hard on Abraham, he didn't tell anybody about what God said. Not his wife, not his servants. In fact, in our parlance, the way we talk, we would say he couldn't even talk about it. It moved him to his core. And yet we see that Abraham is an example of complete devotion to God. We see this from the time that he leaves the land of Ur, or the land of the Chaldees, or what we might later call Babylon. And through his trips all the way down into Egypt and his battles against evil men and going and rescuing Lot, and even his meeting Melchizedek, God's priest and the king of Salem, Jerusalem. Yet for some reason, God sees the need to test Abraham's devotion. And I have to wonder, was this test for God's benefit, or was it for Abraham's? Maybe a better question would be, Eric, where in the world are you going with this? What does this story have to do with stewardship of our treasure, stewardship of our resources? Well, I'll submit to you that I think it has everything to do with stewardship, that it's all about stewardship, that it's all about discipleship. Because you see, friends, we cannot separate stewardship and discipleship. The two concepts are so interwoven that trying to split them apart creates a false dichotomy. Quite frankly, if someone has a discipleship issue, they are likely going to have a stewardship issue. Or the other way around, if somebody has a stewardship issue, they have a discipleship issue. Remember, your time, your talent, and your treasure, your resources are all involved in being a steward of what God has given us to work with. Genesis 14, that's where that story about Lot getting captured while fighting for the king of Sodom, and Abraham goes and rescues him and regains Sodom and Gomorrah back for the king of Sodom. After that battle, Abraham meets Melchizedek, the king of Salem, the king of Jerusalem. In 14, starting at verse 18, we read, "Then the king, Melchizedek, the king of Jerusalem, of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of the Most High God, and he blessed Abraham, saying, 'Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand.'" And do you know what Abraham did next? Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything he had. Abraham willingly gave Melchizedek, God's priest, the first recorded tithe, the first recorded tenth that we have in Scripture. Now, what was the motivation behind that? I think he was doing the same thing Melchizedek was doing. Abraham was recognizing God's blessing on him and giving God credit for the victory in his life. Friends, do you give credit to God for the victories in your life? And how do you show your thanks? How do you express that? Have you ever given a special tithe just to say thanks? Do you give God 10% of your time? Do you carve out a place in your life where your resources and your talent are used for Him? Have you ever stopped to think that when you are talking to somebody about Jesus, you're giving back to God? That is stewardship? That is what Abraham did. In fact, he gave God his whole life. In Abraham, we see a very clear example of a very simple principle. Have only one treasure. We know in Genesis 22:12 that Abraham fully carried through with what he was told to do with Isaac. That he took Isaac up on a mountain. They gathered the sticks. He made a fire. He tied Isaac. He put him on the altar. He raised the knife. His treasure we read, "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said, the voice from the Lord. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And we see very clearly that what Abraham treasured above everything else in his life was God, was having that connection to the Creator that transcends everything in our worldly experience. Nothing was going to come between Abraham and his Lord. Over in Matthew 6, Sermon on the Mount, right? Matthew 5, 6, 7, that ought to mean Sermon on the Mount to you. We see Jesus saying this: "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your" what? "Your heart will be also." That verse right there, verse 21, that's your memory verse for today. I thought about doing the whole section, but I think you get that. For where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Friends, there should be nothing more valuable to us than our relationship with God. Not our stuff, not our money, not our kids, not our job, not our reputation. Our relationship with God should be what we treasure the most. Everything that we have, time, talent, treasure, resources, should be used to store up treasures in heaven. By the way, what is it that we can send ahead of us to heaven? What is it? What is it that God treasures? Is it not the souls of men and women? When you really stop to think about it, those souls that Jesus died for. Friends, if we treasure what God treasures, it is only natural and fitting that we support the kingdom of heaven with everything that we have. Building up the body, helping each other to grow and to understand so that we can reach out, helping other people to understand the ways of God, so that builds up the body. Yes? And we can do that one relationship at a time. And it's not form a huge, big friendship before you say something. It is speaking to somebody, even in an aisleway at Walmart or at a bathroom at a restaurant. You speak to them in that moment that lets them know you see them, that they are valuable, that starts a conversation that can change their life. It can be a 1-minute relationship. Friend, we do not fully understand the concept of discipleship if we haven't reached the point of giving our whole life over to God. We do not fully understand the concept of worship if we haven't reached the point of giving our whole selves fully over to God. Friends, we don't understand the concept of God as Father if we haven't reached the point of giving our whole life over to God. Friends, we cannot understand the cross or the grace or the self-sacrificing God if we cannot give ourselves fully over to Him. If we cannot get those concepts, then stewardship's going to sound foreign to us. Robert Harris, preacher, writer, a man who enjoyed a good laugh. Robert Harris, Asheville, North Carolina, once wrote this. He said, if one first gives himself to the Lord, then all other giving is easy. First things first. John Maxwell, you guys have heard of John Maxwell, preacher out in California and kind of a leadership, church leadership guru. John Maxwell tells a story of a Christian that was in his church that had a financial problem. And he had come up to Dr. Maxwell and he said, you know, I used to make $200 a week, and I would tithe my $20 faithfully. But you know what? Now I'm making 10 times that, and I'm having trouble letting loose of a $200 tithe. It just doesn't seem fair when most don't have to give nearly that. What can I do? John Maxwell looked at him and said, "Brother, let's pray about it." So they bowed their heads, and Dr. Maxwell prayed this. He said, "Lord, my brother is having a trouble obeying you. His problem started when you began to bless him financially. Lord, I pray that you will providentially bring circumstances into his life that will reduce his salary back to where he can be, where it was, so that he can be once again faithful to you." The man jumped up and said, "Oh, no, I can tithe, I can tithe." That guy didn't have a money problem. He had a master problem. Abraham teaches us this too, another very simple principle. Have only one master. Friends, if we are the masters of our own destiny, then God is not. If God is not our master, then the cross has no meaning. And if the cross has no meaning, friends, then we are just dead in our sin. If it is true that God's sin-erasing, soul-saving grace comes to us freely through the cross of Jesus Christ, and we can be free from guilt and shame and the consequences of sin, for that to happen, we must declare a new master over our lives and turn our lives over to him, and today live for the kingdom of heaven.